Welcome, you all. Thank you so much for being here. This is our workshop on cognitivism and the arts. I'm not going to explain to you what cognitivism, what the arts is, no point. I'm going to shortly present our first speaker. It is Vidmar Jovanovic, he is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences of the University of Rijeka, Croatia. Our work focuses on the relationship between art and knowledge, especially in the fields of literature, narrative fiction, television, intersection of aesthetics and ethics. She also works on the philosophy of Kant, particularly his aesthetics.
Hello everyone, it is such a pleasure and joy to be here. This seems like an amazing event and I'm super excited to be participating in it. I feel really honored and I really want to thank Vitor for organizing this and for making us speak on like the most important philosophers in the world. It's a great thing and I'm super excited to have this opportunity to share this war with my dear colleagues Monica and Dave. When Vitor first suggested this, I was kind of excited about going through several different options, but then finally I decided to kind of selfishly use this opportunity to actually give voice to the ideas that I have been considering for a while, but have just never really put in writing or in presentation. So this is going to be the first time, and I'm really interested to hear your comments on it afterwards. So I've been working on aesthetic cognitivism like ever since I was a baby in philosophy. It was the topic of my PhD. But in doing so, I was kind of primarily focused on literature, only slightly interested in film and television. And why I'm saying that is because I was always interested in exploring the relationship between a work of literature and knowledge without somehow considering the fact that literature is a form of art. So when I was approaching literature, it was as a source of knowledge. I was always doing it from the perspective of an epistemologist, and I would often say things like, I will ignore the aesthetic features of literature, I don't mind, I don't care about it. I'm glad that people recognize it as an art form, but for me, it doesn't really matter that it is an art form. And some people were fine by that, but some people usually criticized me on the account of ignoring what is actually the crucial element of literature, and that is the fact that it is first and foremost a work of art. So, you know, as your research grows and as your thinking expands, I finally got to this idea that, okay, I should probably start to consider how does the fact that literature is a work of art, that a literary work is a work of art, how does that in a way feature into my thinking about the cognitive value of literature? So my presentation today is the first step in that direction. I don't think I will have time to present my very wide story, but hopefully I can give you the gist of it. And then hopefully you can tell me whether or not I'm on the right path in doing so. So aesthetic cognitivism is the kind of, and there is a handout, I hope you have it. I will just go through it. I don't think I will add much in addition to what's already on it. So you can maybe follow it if that makes it easier for you to understand my presentation. So aesthetic cognitivism is usually roughly defined as the view that we can learn from art, that art is a rich source of knowledge and other, let's say, cognitively or epistemically, for the most part, I will be using these two as synonyms, right? So that art is a cognitively rich source of knowledge and other epistemic gains. And traditionally, people who defend or who criticize aesthetic cognitivism take it to consist of two main claims. So the epistemic one, which states that art is a source of knowledge. I'm following here Barry's God definition, and God basically says that works of art and literary works in particular can non-trivially teach us things. And in my work so far, I was very focused on trying to kind of provide a theory as to how that happens. I developed this whole account of literary works being a kind of testimony, and I brought in quite a lot of epistemology in order to show that there are all sorts of cognitive benefits that we can learn from that. Now, in doing so, I have always kind of ignored the second important element, as I mentioned, of aesthetic cognitivism, and that is what Barry Scott calls the aesthetic claim, which is the claim that the capacity of a work to teach us in under certain condition an aesthetic merit of the work. So in this particular way, for this branch of cognitivism, the idea that you can learn from art is something that gives art its value. So far, so good, right? Now, again, I'm not really going to be focusing on this today. My interest today, my focus for today is trying to understand how this aesthetic claim, or how does the fact that literary works do have this important aesthetic dimension to them, how does that figure with respect to their capacity to help us become better cognitive and ethical agents. And some of the issues that got me thinking about that are claims made by aesthetic anti-cognitivists or skeptics, so the sorts of people who, for various reasons, caution us against the epistemic claim and against the aesthetic one, and sometimes also against both. So my focus for today is primarily trying to give an answer to these guys, rather than to actually showing that the cognitive value of literature is also at least part of its aesthetic value. So the kind of, let's say, arguments that I am working against are the following. Going way back to the antiquity, Plato's criticism of art, Plato basically argues that we have epistemic reasons for concern. Among the others, issues with aesthetic properties of language. So the idea being that because poetic language is so melodic and it's so nice and it kind of captures all our attention and all our emotions, we become irrational, we become sensitive, we become emotional, and that makes us more easily acceptable to the problematic messages that art sometimes conveys. So the aesthetic features of the poetic language is one aspect that Plato was concerned with. Then, way back into the 19th century, Stein Olsen argued that in light of the aesthetic qualities, and he also gives some other reasons, but putting that aside for the moment, as he says, literature is not an informative discourse, and therefore pursuing a literary work with the aim or even with the outcome of actually learning something is not part of what you do when you engage with literature. When you engage with literature, you are engaging with the aesthetics of language, and you should be exploring the beauty of language. You should be focused on how a certain author is actually using language, rather than trying to see the kind of cognitive or informative messages within that language. So again, it is all about the aesthetics of literary text. In a similar way, in his work with Peter Lamar, they argued that the proper way to address, the proper way to engage with a literary work is to take what they call a literary stance, which is basically a kind of expectation that you bring into your experience of reading, and this expectation kind of guides your attention so that you are responding to the literary features, the way, for example, in which content and theme are united, the way in which the other literary devices are employed, the way in which coherently you get to this coherently created stories, which is also an aesthetic object of appreciation, etc. But you are not really getting to any kind of cognitive values or messages, because again, literature is not there for you to learn something, it is for you to enjoy. It is for you to really appreciate it, a literary work, as an artistic achievement, first and foremost. So for them, the idea is that if you really assume the literary stance, then you cannot at the same time be kind of engaging with the cognitive dimension of the work, in the sense that paying attention to work's literary qualities is, on their view, incompatible with assessing its epistemic relevance and when paying attention to them. Lamarck, in his subsequent work, developed this notion even further, and he has this, as I find it, very lovely, very engaging theory about what he calls opaque reading, where he basically argues that when we engage with literature as literature, when we engage with literature as an aesthetic object, our reading is supposed to be sensitive to the literary qualities and to what they describe, in the sense that you can't separate the two. You can't take the message or the cognitive element or the proposition that you think you are learning out of your reading experience without also acknowledging the kind of artistic achievement that went into developing this. And of course, because the two cannot be separated, you can't argue that there is something that you actually learn from literature, because immediately you have kind of this aesthetic package rather than just cognitive deliverance. And for Lamarck, this is one of the reasons why literature can't be cognitively valuable, because if something is, if a work is cognitively valuable, you should be able to paraphrase it. You should be able to separate the kind of cognitive message or the cognitive information from the kind of writing that sustains it. Given that you can't really do that in literature, it makes no sense to discuss literature with respect to the things that you learn from it. You just can't separate the two. And most recently, something that I think it's very troubling for orthocognitivists is a very, very extensive criticism of cognitivist position by Greg Curry in his latest work, 220, where he gives a bunch of reasons against anti-cognitivists. I don't think we have the time to go into them, but one element of his criticism that I want to focus on today is his claim that he's primarily concerned with fiction, but we can, of course, extend that to literature generally. And he basically says that because fictional works are usually aesthetically very complex, in the sense that there is always a certain style, there are always certain conventions, there is always this kind of expectations of literary value in it. Basically, all of these aspects make a certain work so dense and so aesthetically complex that it's very hard for people to actually understand whether they are responding to the work because they feel that they have learned something from the work itself, or whether they are responding to the way in which the work is created. So basically, whether we are, as readers, responding to a particular style, or maybe to the particular manner in which a given work is kind of developed, and then we confuse this for the kind of cognitive gain that we think that we are having. Because on Curry's view, you can never really be certain whether you are responding to the one or the other. He thinks that it's just plain wrong to say that you've actually learned something. You haven't. You just have this impression that you have learned something because you are actually taken in by linguistic qualities, by what he calls aesthetic complexity. And I would use this notion of aesthetic complexity throughout my talk today because I think it kind of captures very nicely this thing that is said to be a problem. So my aim for today is to kind of address these kinds of challenges, Plato's, Olson, Lamarck and Olson's, and particularly Curry, and I want to show that neither the aesthetic quality of the work itself nor the aesthetic aspects of our literary experience should be seen or is an obstacle to aesthetic cognitivism. So I do want to do that by exploring some of the ways in which I think that this notion of aesthetic complexity that Harry develops can in fact and should perhaps be incorporated into the explanation of how we learn from literature. Now, in doing so, and I move to session 2 now, I'm going to be using the example of Michel Houellebecq's novel Submission. I don't have any particular reasons for addressing this book, this novel, rather than any other than the fact that I happened to be reading this novel just as I was preparing for this, so it kind of seemed a very good example. I'm a big fan of Houellebecq's work, though not for the political topics that he expresses. But basically, if my theory works, it should work with pretty much every novel that is cognitively valuable. So this is just a case study. Hopefully, if you don't like it or if you haven't read it, it shouldn't take away from your, let's say, interest into what I have to say. I don't know if you know what the work is about. It is basically a novel written 10 years ago, which focuses on France's political atmosphere into 24th. And what Houellebecq did is he kind of imagined, the work is written as a kind of a thought experiment, he imagined that the Muslim party, the Muslim Brotherhood, will take over France, not in any kind of radical or aggressive way, so there's not an armed conflict, there's no war. It is just, as it happens, that the Muslim party won, they got the elections, and now they're slowly kind of building up the Muslim society, so to say. And the main character, Francois, is an academic. He's a professor of literature. He is, as all Houellebecqian characters are, deeply depressed. He doesn't think that there's any value to the world. He is very, very nihilist in a way. And I guess the main premise of the work is, let's see what happens to this kind of attitude, this kind of gloomy, nihilistic, very sad, very miserable, depressed person. What can happen within this kind of political rearrangement? So that's kind of the theme of the novel, right? And I think it's interesting in this context because obviously at every single level, the novel is just factually wrong. The Muslim party did not win the France election. The Islam is not the dominant religion in France. So this is the novel which, if you are an anti-cognitivist, you can really say, look, you guys are so wrong. There's nothing right here. So there's nothing that you can learn. And yet, regardless of all these factual mistakes in the novel, and I'm, quoting the factual mistakes, I don't think it's a mistake, as you'll see in my talk. I still think there's so much that we can learn from this, so I think the book is very cognitively valuable. So it actually represents a very nice example of literary cognitivism and how I think the literary cognitivists can respond to the charges. So before we got into that, let me just use a couple of moments to explain this notion of aesthetic complexity and how it is usually applied to literature. So what people like Olsen and Curry and Lamarck to extent have in mind when they dismiss literature as a valid source of knowledge is they say that literature is aesthetically valuable, it is an artistic achievement, and if you really want to engage it as a literature, right, if you really want to explore it as an artistic form, then you should be paying attention to many different segments, artistic segments in the work, and I'll explain what these are. But the idea is that if you really pay attention, if you're really focused, if you're really considering this aspect of the work, then somehow you can't transfer that, neither that interest nor that gain, into kind of cognitive gains that you are actually getting. In other words, this is also slated, if you think about other kinds of writings, other kinds of discourse that we use in order to gain knowledge, and obviously scientific discourse is going to be our primary kind of reference point. What you notice is that we can really gain knowledge from those works which are clear, which are precise, which are not ambiguous, which are kind of openly stating their claims, which are supporting these claims with additional arguments, which are kind of justified, they give you justification for taking these claims, and all of these things are absent from literature. We don't find neither the arguments, nor the justification, nor the kind of reliability statements in the literature. All of these things are absent. And what you actually find in literature is just very layered, very complex, very layered kind of text, which you then need to probe in order to really appreciate the many artistic achievements that are kind of buried there by the writer. So one way in which this kind of complexity is evidenced in our engagements with literary works is the fact that there are multiple layers, as I mentioned, of interpretation, and one of these layers include analyzing how a particular novel kind of features with respect to author's literary opus generally, or with respect to other intellectual resources. So the claim here would be that literary works are kind of embedded into our intellectual practices, not so much to deliver a kind of cognitive message, to bring new insights into the public sphere, but the thing is that literary texts are kind of creating a coherent whole within themselves. So when I'm considering whatever it is that Welbeck writes in Submission, my appreciation relates to how Welbeck generally writes about these things, given his previous works. So how his gloomy character developed from Welbeck's, let's say, previous novels? How does the character change? How does the particular topic of love or sexuality or of romantic love, how is that different in Submission with respect to some other works by Welbeck? This is one way in which aesthetic complexity is developed. Another way is that you take into consideration how does a particular work feature with respect to, let's say, philosophical views on a particular topic. So what it is, for example, that Schopenhauer said about human loneliness that is kind of evident or that is represented or exemplified in Welbeck's novel. That's the kind of aesthetic complexity that as viewers, as readers, as the audience, we should be engaging with, rather than thinking about, oh, what it is that I've learned about love and loneliness from reading Welbeck. That's just wrong. What appreciation, what literary appreciation is all about is understanding how this particular work relates to other literary achievements of this author or to the intellectual discourses more general. So that's just a very, let's say, very, very basic level, and this is something that you usually find if you read literary criticism. They will kind of give you the context, so to say, within the, of the author. Then there is also this idea that when literary writers engage with certain topics, with certain themes, although they're very often intellectual themes, themes of loneliness, themes of love, themes of political kind of systems and values, etc., they are not really doing it as science might, right? To deliver a kind of message, to give readers a kind of precise insights into these notions. No, they are doing it in order to kind of show you how the subject level, whatever happens in the story, how does that exemplify a certain theme? But you are not supposed to take something out of it and kind of transport it, if you like, into the real world and come to think about the real world differently. So just a very basic example, this is the opening sentence of Welbeck's novel. He says, "Through all the years of my sad youth, Huysmans remained a companion, a faithful friend. Never once did I doubt him, never once was I tempted to drop him or take up another subject." So the main hero of the novel is a literary scholar obsessed with the great French writer Huysmans, who is no longer as famous as he used to be. And part of the theme of Welbeck's novel is actually to explore the role of literature in one's life. So whether or not we can kind of through literature, whether we can gain a kind of meaning, whether we can become consulted, for example, whether we can form friendships with literary writers, with literary characters, but also whether or not this notion of friendship, how does that feature into our lives? Every now and then throughout the novel, the main character, Francois, is going to give you comments about the role of friendship. So that's kind of this idea of aesthetic complexity. You need to understand that Welbeck is kind of exploring the role of friendship in our lives, and he's doing that by creating this character who is in fact, who has this idea that Huysmans is his best friend, although Huysmans is long gone and dead and has absolutely no contact, obviously, with the main character. So the role of friendship and literature in one's life, the impact of this particular author on the main character's choices. This is kind of important because throughout the novel, our main character is trying to retrace everything that Huysmans did. And Huysmans was also important in the sense that he converted to Christianity. So there is this notion of religion experience that will matter down the line for the main character. But again, the idea is you're not supposed to be reading this and trying to gain an insight into the nature of friendship, or maybe come to treat your friends differently, because you are not supposed to be taking anything out of the novel and transporting it into the real life. You are only supposed to be kind of appreciating the way in which this particular motive gives rise to different kinds of linguistic and literary values that you find in the work. Then there can be this kind of aesthetic complexity with respect to the subject-theme nexus, and you can think here about the love story in the novel between the main character, who is a French-born guy, and the character of Miriam. She was one of his students, but the interesting point here is that she is a Jew, and once that the Muslim brothers take over, obviously her position and the position of her family is a bit problematic, so she has to her family forces her to escape France, and they move to the other part of the world. They have to flee, and obviously this is going to create a lot of problems for Francois. So in a way, this kind of failed relationship is again important in many different ways, to many different layers. So one way in which this motive is implemented into the work and into the kind of this thematic layerness of the work is through this incapacity of the main character to establish a loving, caring sexual relation, which is of course a repeated theme throughout Houellebecq's work. Then there is also this idea that this particular theme is relevant for understanding the main character motives to consider Islam as a solution to the sexual desire and the need for companionship. So one thing that happens throughout the novel is that different male characters who switch to Islam, who kind of accept this religion, are given wives, right? 1, 2, 3 wives, depending on some other elements. And then the idea is, well, this is one way in which the loneliness can kind of be overcome through arranged marriages. And this is an important element, again, for the way in which Houellebecq sees our contemporary society and people not being able to really form meaningful, loving, marital relationships. So in that way, the idea is here is a different model. Maybe this model would work differently with respect to our personal needs and desires. Then there is also the political importance of Miriam's background, and this is just several comments from the critical work on this novel. So Miriam is the only character to express love for France, however incoherently, giving the impression that she and people like her could have been a significant assets to the country. So the idea is that we are actually not aware of the value that different people living with us actually have for the country itself. Another critic suggests that through Miriam, we witness the deteriorating situation of the Jews in France. The treatment of Miriam in the work calls to mind these questions. For example, could Jews flourish in contemporary France? What kind of life would they have? And the quote continues with urgency. So hopefully you can already see that all of these critical comments on the novel are kind of presupposing the cognitivism that I want to defend. They are not treating this as a separate to the work. They really see it as implemented into the work itself. So part of the reason why I'm focusing your attention to this is to show that this aesthetic complexity can actually work in my advantage, right, in the advantage of cognitivism, but we'll come to that later. And then probably the most important element, something that is really what all the anti-cognitivists going back to Plato had in mind, is that basically the literary language itself, which is so different from the scientific writing, is the main reason why we should be careful and maybe even dismiss the possibility that we can learn from literature. So it is the literary language that is deeply layered, that is aesthetically too complex. You can also think here of the notion of semantic density, right, which is usually applied to poetry, but I think it can work very well here. So there's always more that is expressed than it actually is, and there is always this aesthetic element which kind of keeps the cognitive element down to the message, the insight, the understanding that you maintain are kind of not important. So this is, I think, a very nice comment by Henry Smith on the way in which Houellebecq uses the style. And again, go back to Carey's idea that we are actually responding to the style rather than to the work itself. So the work characterized, Houellebecq's style is characterized by a particular kind of resistance, which comes from frustrating our usual systems of coordinates and multiplication of contradictions. And of course, in any kind of scientific writing, you cannot be contradictory. If there is a contradiction in philosophical paper, you are dismissed and buried once and for all, right? So in order to claim that a certain piece of writing is informative and cognitively valuable, it shouldn't be contradictory. And obviously, from this quote, we see that Houellebecq's style is extremely contradictory. So, from constant process of reversibility, reversible meanings, and contradictory sentences, rapid juxtapositions, contradictions, apparent non-sequiturs, something that Smith calls dissociation, which is basically the idea of keeping two incompatible ideas separately in mind, and disavowal, which is the process where you negate one of them. So here is the example. That went well this time anyway. So obviously, Houellebecq is contradicting himself here by suggesting that something that actually had a good outcome is a one-time deal and probably will not happen again. Teachers have been attacked in 4 cities, but I had never met a colleague who had been attacked. So again, if you're reading this from the point of view of a cognitivist, you are not really certain how to take in these sentences. He's giving you an information and then he's kind of withholding it. He's taking it back. So obviously not something that you can find in scientific discourse, and for people like Lamarck and Wilson and Plato and Curry, the reason why we shouldn't trust we shouldn't take literature to be cognitively valuable. And again, such literary devices force the reader to feel the sense of threat and danger. So these kind of literary devices are important for maintaining a certain kind of atmosphere. And of course, atmosphere can also have its aesthetic element. So again, it's something that takes away from your capacity to really focus on the kind of cognitive element of the work. Such literary devices bring in two different tones of voice and two different attitudes, simultaneously inviting the reader and pulling her away. So there are moments in the text when you are when you feel very close to the main character and when you really want to take in everything that he has to say. But then through these kind of literary devices, he also kind of pushes you away because he's really nihilistic, he's a misogynist, he's not a very nice person to be around. So you really don't know how to take in, right? And obviously, if you don't know how to approach something, what kind of impression to get, you can't really say that, oh, this is an insight that I'm getting, right? So you're constantly being driven, but then also pushed aside. The experience of surprise and dislocation prompted by such juxtapositions recurs throughout the book, and it forces us continually to shift our position, right? So basically, because we are constantly being driven in and then pushed aside, we are never in a position where we can kind of with a clear head, actually understand what it is that we should be kind of considering as the proper cognitive value. So this seems to be an issue. And so what I want to do is to see what kind of epistemic function can this kind of aesthetic complexity fulfill within the literary work and in our literary experiences. And I'm going to claim that aesthetic complexity is an important mechanism that enables the epistemic dimension of a work to shine through. Now, I have to say I am relying here on something that has traditionally been a rather famous claim by many cognitivists, starting with Martha Nussbaum, of course, where the idea is that it is precisely, as she would say, it is precisely because literary language is so different from the scientific one that literary language is then better equipped to kind of transfer, to give voice to exemplify the kind of very complex emotional states that people go through. So no matter how good psychologist you are, or no matter how good sociologist you are, you can't ever really successfully depict the kind of emotional chaos that people go through in their lives. And this is what literature does well, and it does it so well precisely because of this kind of language. So here is the example. The text, the chapter, the one aspect from the book, one quote from the book. So this is when Francois is starting to realize that his long-distance affair with Miriam isn't really going to last, and he is kind of sensing, he has this really strong intuition that she has already started a relationship with someone else. And he writes, this is kind of stream of thought that he is giving us. Lately, she has given up salutation dearest and replaced it with the neutral Francois. It was only a matter of weeks, I thought, before she, too, would announce that she had met someone. The meeting had already taken place, that much I knew. I don't know exactly how I knew, but something in her choice of words, in the diminishing number of her smiley faces and hearts, left no room for doubt. She just didn't have the courage to tell me. She was pulling away from me. It was as simple as that. She was making a new life for herself in Israel. What did I expect? She was a lovely girl, intelligent and kind, extremely attractive. Yes, what did I expect? For Israel, at any rate, she showed the same unflagging enthusiasm. It's hard, but I know why I'm here, she wrote. Obviously, that was more than I could say. So again, in this short passage, you see all the literary devices that Smith mentions before with reference to Welbeck's style. What I want you to kind of focus on is this idea that through this particular description, you can really sense the mental state of a person who is thinking about the failure, the imminent failure of his relationship, kind of switching from his own thinking, what could I expect, to her thinking. She has certainly met someone, that much I knew, and kind of trying to balance the two, and then giving additional force to his own conclusions. Yes, what did I expect, right? And then the final sentence, obviously that was more than I could say, is again kind of going back to all the things that he previously stated about himself, about his incapacity to find meaning. So she's someone who, although she was forced to leave, she has reasons, she knows why she did what she did, and again, that was more than I could say. So I'm still kind of here, not there, not knowing what to do with myself. So I think this is a very nice literary example of this kind of tormented soul. And obviously all the literary devices that are employed here, I think are very successful in bringing forward this kind of very, very complex emotional state. But then, of course, the problem is Plato and his fellows will come and say, well, it is precisely because you are responding to the literary power, to the aesthetic qualities of the language, that you can't really claim that this description is in any way reliable of the kind of mental states that people go through when they are experiencing a relationship breakdown. So, although I do accept this traditional, let's say, Martha Nussbaum's argument, I want to bring it one step further into the epistemic cognitivism debate, the aesthetic cognitivism debate. And I want to claim that it's not like some people in continental philosophy might claim that these descriptions are faithful, true, or in other way reliable. I think they are, for the most part, but let's leave that aside. My claim is that the aesthetic element of language triggers, sustain, and direct readers' attention. The reader focuses on those elements of the text she might otherwise neglect, and it is through that kind of focusing that the actual cognitive power of the work then starts to really get her attention. It is because we are taken in by the literary power of the work that we are kind of motivated to stop and to actually consider what it is that the work is describing, what it is that we are reading about, and then we take that and start to engage with that at the reflective intellectual level that then in the end brings us the cognitive value. Okay, so I have like 3 examples here where I really want to show how it is that this coming together of cognitive and aesthetic part actually works. So remember that for Bobek, the crucial problem is that people are basically incapable of finding meaningful experiences, right? There is always something that comes in the way of our capacity to actually gain kind of meaning and value. And what Bobek is doing in this particular chapter is he's describing 3 different occasions when the main character is trying to find meaning and he's trying to connect with other people, but then, as you'll see, he fails every time. So I'm just going to read the second and the third one because I really want to come to the positive part of my paper. So I will skip the example number 5 on page 4 and I will go to the example number 2. And this is a description when Francois is sitting in the chapel with a lot of other religious people, and they've been reading some poetry, some French poetry about French nationalistic movements and about this religious poet who is kind of bringing people together. And Francois is looking at that and he's thinking, as for these young Catholics, did they love their homeland? Were they ready to give up everything for their country? I felt ready to give up everything, not really for my country, but in general. I was in a strange state. It seemed that the Virgin, because they are in the church and they are watching the Virgin Mary statue, it seemed that the Virgin was rising from her pedestal and growing in the air. The baby Jesus seemed ready to detach himself from her, and it seemed to me that all he had to do was raise his pen and his right hand, and the pagans and idolaters would be destroyed, and the keys to the world restored to him as its Lord, its possessor, and its master. And then there is a break, and there is an empty line, or maybe I was just hungry. So what Bobek is doing here, notice first how many layers in this original description. When he says, I felt ready to give up everything, not really for my country, but in general, you can read this as his general state of mind. Remember, he's deeply pessimistic, he's deeply depressed character, constantly thinking about committing suicide and kind of feeling that he doesn't have the courage to do that. So when he says, I felt ready to give up everything in general, you can read this as a testament of suicide, but you can also read it, and this is how this particular description should be read in this place in the book, as at this particular moment, I am at the brink of feeling this kind of religious experience and finding meaning. To give up everything in general means give up everything and dedicate myself to the union with these people and to finally feel that I am a part of a whole, part of something bigger, a part of people coming together, right? But then, through this juxtaposition and all the other literary devices, he concludes, or maybe I was just hungry. So it's not really that I felt spiritual awakening, I was just hungry, right? So this is the kind of juxtaposition that Smith alludes to. But it is also, as you read, you really get this sense of almost capturing this spiritual moment of awakening and then kind of letting it go, right? And you can also see just this sentence, I was in a strange stage, it seemed to me that Virgin was rising. So the way in which description work is that as a reader, it gets you to the point where you can almost sense the people, the way in which Francois comes to these other people and kind of connects to them, and then that kind of slipping through. So phenomenologically, it seems to me that the language works so that you really experience that kind of almost having it and then having to let it go. And then the third example is important because in the third example, this is the final attempt of Francois to kind of regain this kind of spirituality. But after a while with the second one, there was still some hope left. You will now see that with the third one, there's absolutely nothing left. No juxtaposition, no non sequitur. There's absolutely nothing that would suggest that there's still a possibility to actually gain meaning. So the next morning, I went back to the chapel of Our Lady, which was now deserted. The Virgin waited in the shadows, calm and timeless. She had serenity, she had power, but little by little, I felt myself losing touch. I felt her moving away from me in space and across the centuries, while I sat there in my pew, shriveled and puny. After half an hour, I got up, fully deserted by the spirit, reduced to my damaged, perishable body, and I sadly descended the stairs that led to the car park. So notice that everything is kind of given you directly with a lot of these words which are pointing to how devastated he is, how lonely he is, how broken he feels. But there's nothing that could suggest that this is reversible. He's just leaving. And you can also, for example, when he describes, I felt the Virgin moving away from me in space in a cross, you can literally sense the kind of distance that is being created between him and this kind of possibility of meaningful experience. So I think this is this is something that you can't really gain from other kinds of discourses. You can gain it at, let's say, propositional level, but you can't really relive that, so to say, in your own imagination, even in your own body, I think. But this is just me reading a lot of embedded cognition work recently, so we can put that aside. Okay, I'm going to skip some parts here just to use my final 5 minutes to finally defend aesthetic complexity. How precisely does it accomplish epistemic function within the novel? So I'm going to suggest that the aesthetic complexity is related to the sense of beauty and other aesthetic properties of a work. And I think that the kind of beauty, the kind of literariness that we respond to have actually two important segments. So there is the aesthetic one, which is us trying to understand how the medium is utilized, how the language works, so as to generate a sense of aesthetic pleasure. So the idea is if you're really taken in by, let's say, this description of the third description, if you're really taken in by that, it is the aesthetic power of the language that really kind of grabs your attention. And you focus on it and you're trying to understand the way in which this particular set of words and the way in which they are coming together is giving rise to the kind of intellectual, so to say, experience that you are having. So how is the sense of loneliness and separation depicted in this particular novel? Well, one way in which it is through sentences like the one that I've just read. I felt her moving away from me in space and across the centuries, right? You don't usually move through centuries, right? So this is something that is very specific to the literary style. So through your kind of interest in the aesthetics of the language, you do start to recognize how the particular sentences are used and employed in order to depict a particular state of mind, a particular emotion, a particular problem, a particular perspective or something. But you are only considering that because you are really taken in by the language itself, by the aesthetic complexity of the language itself. And then that kind of, in this, let's say, abstract reflection on what it is that is happening with the text, there is also this epistemological part, and that is, what is the work telling us? What is that is being conveyed through this particular language? I think you do need to recognize the description itself, whether it is an emotion, whether it is a process, whether it is a conundrum, whatever, but you do need to recognize what it is that this particular language is saying. And I think this kind of happens simultaneously. When you become aware of how the language is used, you also become aware of what it is that this particular language is conveying. So what it is that the work is telling us, and again, I think given the personal, subjective nature of aesthetic experience, when we find ourselves moved by a certain aesthetic experience, we recognize that it addresses not only our aesthetic taste, but also our intellectual interest as well. And in the wider version of this project, I have quite a lot material here from epistemology of curiosity and how curiosity can also be subjective and respond to our particular intellectual interest. So for example, for those of you who do not find these particular elements from Bobek's work capturing or beautiful, that's probably because you are not as interested maybe as I am in this notion of loneliness, separateness, incapacity to commit to others, etc., etc. And on the other hand, there's a lot of work on aesthetic emotions, which also suggests that our aesthetic emotions are also in some sense directed to the intellectual concerns that we have. I can discuss this more in the Q&A if you want. But there is also, and really going towards the end now, there is also another kind of support for my claim here, and this is my strong reliance on Angela Breitenbach account of intelligible beauty in science. So Breitenbach is a Kantian scholar who is working a lot on the scientific theories, and for a while she was kind of concerned with exploring this notion that we often find scientific theories beautiful, although obviously beauty is not supposed to be in any way related to the truthfulness of scientific theory. And then what Breitenbach suggests, and I think she even took something, is that, and this is a quote from her, we understand the aesthetic appraisal of a theory as a response to the experienced harmony, and you can obviously sense Kant here, to the experienced harmony of our intellectual capacities and suitability for making sense of the world. In aesthetic judgment, we express our delight in the experienced harmony between the power of our intellectual and the world and experience of harmony which we become aware through our engaging with the theory. So the way in which I apply Breitenbach's work to works of literature is to suggest that the kind of satisfaction, right, the aesthetic satisfaction that we feel when we engage with particular words is the result of our understanding and appreciating and liking how the linguistic medium is being utilized, but not just utilized per se, so to speak, but utilized so that it addresses a particular kind of intellectual concerns that we have, right? So it's not enough that the language, I'm not suggesting that you will only like those works which are kind of, which address intellectual worries, intellectual concerns that you have. You can appreciate the work of literature, although you may not, let's say, you don't feel that it deals with an important topic or whatever. But those works, I think, which we really find beautiful, and those works which we really find ourselves strongly connected to, I think this kind of connection is the result of the way in which aesthetic complexity is utilized in order to depict a particular kind of intellectual concerns that you have, that you experience at a particular time. And it is precisely because of the aesthetic power of language that your attention is in the end drawn to these particular intellectual concerns, and you recognize how these concerns are actually being worked out in this particular linguistic description. In addition to Breitenbach, Elizabeth Schellekens has done a lot of work on this. She started out with the conceptual art, but I think quite a lot of what she says can also be applied to works of literature. So Schellekens has this idea that work also have aesthetic character, in the sense that aesthetic experience can be epistemically motivating and can be part of what motivates our cognitive ambitions. For me, I'm kind of branching out here, suggesting that the kind of cognitive ambitions that she allures to here are precisely the kind of cognitive ambitions with respect to things that we want to understand and things that we are interested in. So, in conclusion, I want to suggest that my claim again, is not that aesthetic is necessarily revelatory of the truth. So I'm not going into that kind of mystical, some authors had that, in poetry, for example, because the language is such and such, it has to reveal the truth. I'm not saying that. The aesthetic in aesthetic cognitivism explains, I think, why we feel that our particular intellectual concerns are addressed in literature, why we respond cognitively to what we read, why we respond so deeply personally and emotionally. Obviously, if we care about certain topics, if certain topics are important to us, we are going to care for the works which address them, particularly when these works also address our aesthetic taste and when they give us something that we take deep pleasure in. Because we really feel that things that we cared for so deeply have been recognized and have been addressed and have helped us come to think about these things and process them. Why there is such a discrepancy of reactions to one and the same work. So for many people, Lamarck and Curry bring out this argument whereby they suggest that literature cannot be a valid source of knowledge, because if there is knowledge, knowledge should be equally available to everyone as a scientific theory, for example, independently of their preferences, of their values, of their perspectives, of their experiences, etc. And of course, that makes sense with respect to the scientific work, with respect to natural laws, for example, but I don't think it makes sense with respect to what is usually recognized as humanistic interests, right? Values, meanings, emotions, perspectives, outlooks, etc. And I don't think that this is a problem for literary. I've never understood why they would say this is a problem for aesthetic cognitivism, but I do think that my theory finally explains why we respond differently. It's not our failure to recognize cognitive dimension, it is just that, you are at a different place, so to say, intellectually. You haven't had enough experience maybe to recognize the importance of something, or you have had so much experience that whatever the writer is putting out there doesn't mean much to you because you have already kind of worked it out. So I think my theory can account for this discrepancy of reactions to literature. I think it also explains why the kind of knowledge provided by literature is not solely propositional, but because of this kind of abstract thinking that you engage with, it includes epistemic benefits related to how an epistemic agent comes to think about the world, change of her perspective, reconsideration of certain issues, acknowledgement, etc., or what John Gibson calls indirect humanism. So the idea that it's not only propositional knowledge that we are gaining, but it is actually our capacity to become more reflective as epistemic agents, right? To think about the world somehow in different ways. So thank you. I'm sorry if I went too far.
All right.